On April 28, 1944, the USS Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort still smelling of fresh paint, was commissioned into the Pacific Fleet. Her crew, a mix of reservists and young volunteers, trained relentlessly under Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland. The ship's bell, polished and gleaming, symbolized their hopes for a safe voyage ahead, but the steel of her hull was thin, and the men knew they would be asked to fight against giants. By October 1944, the Japanese Showa plan was in motion. The commander of the center force, spearheaded by the super battleship Yamato, slipped his fleet through the San Bernardino Strait while American forces stormed the beaches of Leyte. Task Unit 77.4.3, Taffy 3, consisting of escort carriers and a screen of destroyers and destroyer escorts, was the only force standing between the Japanese and the invasion fleet. The ordinary sailors of these tin can ships would soon be thrust into a desperate battle that would test their bonds and their courage to the breaking point. Dawn broke over the Philippine Sea on October 25th, and the men of Taffy 3 were at general quarters before the sun cleared the horizon. Ensign William C. Brooks was flying a search patrol from the escort carrier St. Lo, peering through his Avenger's canopy at an empty ocean. Then he saw them, pagoda masts, like the towers of a floating city, rising from the sea to the north. It was the Japanese center force, 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and a screen of destroyers steaming straight for the Leyte invasion fleet. A squadron of jeep carriers and a handful of tin cans were all that stood in their way. Brooks keyed his radio and shouted the sighting report. Aboard the flagship Fanshawe Bay, Rear Admiral Clifton A.F. Sprague heard the news and knew his world had just tilted. He had 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The enemy had the super battleship Yamato firing her 18-inch guns for the first time in anger at any ship. Sprague ordered every plane launched and the destroyers to form a smoke screen. Then he sent a signal that would become legend. Small boys attacked the enemy main body on the flight decks of the jeep carriers. Pilots scrambled into their cockpits. Wildcats and Avengers roared down the short decks, lifting off into a sky already filled with black shell bursts. Brooks, his fuel low, landed on the Fanshawe Bay to rearm and refuel, then went right back up. Meanwhile, the destroyers and destroyer escorts turned east toward the Japanese battle line. They had no armor, no big guns, and no expectation of survival. They went anyway. Commander Ernest E. Evans was not a man who waited for orders. On the bridge of the destroyer Johnston, he shouted to his helmsman, "All ahead flank, left full rudder." The ship heeled hard, cutting across the Japanese formation at 25 knots. Evans had promised his crew he would give the enemy a belly full of torpedoes. Now he was making good on that promise. The Johnston charged straight into the face of the most powerful surface fleet ever assembled. Japanese cruisers and battleships opened fire at point-blank range. Shells straddled the Johnston, splashing water in geysers the height of her masts. Lieutenant Robert C. Hagen, the gunnery officer, kept his 5-inch guns firing as fast as the loaders could ram shells into the breaches. He watched shells tear through the ship's thin steel, saw men fall. Evans himself took shrapnel wounds but never left the wing of the bridge, cursing and cheering his crew on. At 7:50, the Johnston steadied on a firing run. Hagen's torpedo crew cranked the tubes out and pulled the triggers. 8 torpedoes raced toward the Japanese van. They struck the heavy cruiser Kumano, blowing off her bow in a fountain of fire and steel. The Japanese flagship staggered out of formation, confusion rippling through the enemy battle line. For the first time, the center force's relentless pursuit was broken. Evans had bought the carrier's precious minutes. Across the battle zone, Commander Leon Kintberger drove the destroyer Hool into the same storm. She took hit after hit, her bridge burning, her men dying. Kintberger ordered abandoned ship around 9 in the morning. The Hool rolled over and sank with 267 of her crew. On the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland led his ship in a gun duel with Japanese cruisers. Gunner's mate Paul Henry Carr in Mount 52 fired round after round at an enemy cruiser until a direct hit from a heavy shell obliterated the mount, killing Carr and his entire crew instantly. Only his hand was recovered from the wreckage. The escort carrier Gambier Bay took 15 direct hits from heavy cruiser shells, her hangar deck blazing. She was the only American carrier in history sunk by enemy naval gunfire. Destroyer Heermann fought on. Her skipper, after a shell wrecked the bridge, conned the ship from aft steering and kept her in the fight. Above them, Avengers from all three Taffies hammered the Japanese ships, dropping bombs and torpedoes, while Wildcats from the St. Lo and others strafed the enemy decks. The air attacks and the desperate destroyer charges finally told Admiral Takeo Kurita, convinced he was fighting a much larger force and facing relentless airstrikes, ordered a general withdrawal at 9:20. The Japanese turned north, their advantage thrown away. The Samuel B. Roberts went down minutes later, her crew tumbling into the oil-slicked water. The Johnston, her captain lost with his ship, sank shortly before 10 o'clock. Brooks returned to the Fanshawe Bay, his planes spent. Copeland, Hagen, and over 1,000 survivors were adrift, alone in a vanishing graveyard. The battle was not over, but the tin can sailors had done their job. When a ship sinks, the battlefield vanishes for the men of the Hoole, the Gambier Bay, the Johnston, and the Samuel B. Roberts. The sudden silence after the guns fell was the first thing they noticed. The noise of battle had numbed their fear now. It lifted like a curtain, unveiling their shock and grief. Over 1,000 men dotted the ocean swells, cast about by the currents and the wind. Their world shrank to the circumference of the horizon from sea level. Oil slicks burned lazily around them. Thomas Stevenson, the young supply officer from the Roberts, was adrift with his captain, Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland. Around them, men gathered on life rafts and floater nets. Charles Natter, a strong signalman, swam to a makeshift scaffolding of wooden planks where wounded survivors clung. He tried to help them, ferrying the weakest back to the rafts, but the sharks were gathering. One came up and pulled Thomas Missoura, a friend of Natter's, from the planks. Natter had little time to mourn. Another fin glided toward him, and he was hauled under and vanished from sight. Through the long night, the sharks grew bolder in the pitch-black Pacific. Their movements through phosphorescent plankton left faint glowing trails. Men screamed and were gone. One Johnston sailor, bitten deep in the abdomen, begged for mercy. After nearly an hour, a shipmate pulled out a revolver, misfired it, then produced a knife and cut his throat. Delirium took hold as salt water poisoned their minds. Men hallucinated freshwater fountains, hot coffee, and native girls on shore. Some slipped away into the dark, never seen again. The Kapok life vests, waterlogged, lost their buoyancy by the second day. Rescue came on the morning of October 27th. On the patrol craft PC-623, Lieutenant James A. Baxter was the ship's commanding officer. When his officer of the deck, Lieutenant J.G. Allison Levy, spotted American flares on the horizon and reported them. Baxter twice denied permission to break formation. Levy refused to be relieved of his watch, holding the ship on course toward the flares until the captain's eyes adjusted to the darkness. When Baxter saw the flares himself, he agreed to investigate and ordered the rest of his ships to follow. The crew found the survivors scattered over miles of ocean. Hauling them aboard, the small ship's deck was soon crowded with oil-soaked, exhausted men. Over 1,100 survivors from the 4 sunken ships were pulled from the sea that day. For those who lived, the memory of shipmates lost to sharks, wounds, and madness would never fade. From the patrol craft, the survivors were transferred to larger transports and hospital ships anchored in Leyte Gulf. Days later, Copeland found himself aboard the hospital ship Comfort, zigzagging toward Hollandia. His body had taken a beating, but the deeper wounds were the kind that no doctor could dress, the memory of men pulled under by sharks, the echo of a delirious sailor being knocked senseless to keep him from swimming to his death. For the first time in days, the survivors slept on mattresses. The slow voyage to the rear areas gave the men time to reckon with what they had done. Aboard the Comfort, Copeland found a quiet corner and began writing letters to the families of the men he had lost. He did not know it yet, but the official word of his own survival had already reached Tacoma. His wife Harriet had received a letter that arrived after the mailman's usual rounds, delivered by hand because the carrier knew she would be anxious. When she opened it, she found her husband's matter-of-fact account of the battle, a story of shellfire, sharks, and standing in line to receive malted milk tablets from a captain who had nothing left to give. It would be 3 weeks before Copeland was released from the Naval Hospital in San Francisco, and longer still before he could sit through a full night's sleep without seeing the faces of his dead. In the months that followed, the Navy made its formal accounting of what happened off Samar. The judgment came down in the spring of 1945 when the Presidential Unit Citation was awarded to every ship of Task Unit 77.4.3. The citation itself was a simple document, a scroll of words printed on heavy paper, but to the men who received it, it carried the weight of the dead. In May of that year, Admiral William F. Halsey met Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague at Ulithi and told him, "I want you to know I think you wrote the most glorious page in American naval history that day." It was a remarkable statement from the man whose decision to chase a decoy fleet had left Taffy 3 exposed in the first place. Sprague received the Navy Cross for his leadership, as did Copeland, Kintberger of the Hull, and Hathaway of the Heermann, along with several pilots including William C. Brooks. The highest honor went to Commander Ernest E. Evans of the Johnston, who was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor posthumously, the only member of Taffy 3 to receive the nation's highest recognition for valor. The official honors could not undo the arithmetic of loss. The Hull had lost 267 of its crew of 325, the heaviest toll of any ship in the battle. The Johnston lost 184, the Samuel B. Roberts lost 90, and the Gambier Bay lost 131. And in the water between the sinking and the rescue, an additional 116 men had died of wounds, sharks, or madness. Those numbers were carved into the permanent record, but the men who lived knew that statistics could never capture the shape of a friend's face disappearing beneath a phosphorescent wake. They carried those faces home with them. Copeland returned to Tacoma and resumed his law practice, but his children would later say he was never quite the same man who had shipped out. Commander Leon Kintberger, who lost two-thirds of his crew, survived the war and later retired from the Navy. Commander Amos Hathaway, who conned the Heermann from aft steering, continued his naval career after the war and eventually retired from active service. Admiral Kurita returned to Japan and lived quietly, his decision to withdraw remaining one of the enduring controversies of the battle. Lieutenant Thomas Stevenson, who had prayed for a second chance, kept his vow. He became a devoted husband and father. Signalman Charles Natter, who died trying to rescue shipmates from sharks, was among the 90 men of the Roberts who did not come home. Robert C. Hagan, who had written the Johnston's official action report from memory after being rescued, went on to a quiet life in the States. William C. Brooks left the Navy. Decades later, he found himself at a reunion sitting in a hotel banquet room with the same men he had flown beside pilot Thomas B. Van Brunt, who had dropped bombs on the Japanese fleet that morning, also survived the war and returned home, attending reunions in the years that followed. They were all gray and slowed by age, no longer the young pilots who had roared off the decks of jeep carriers into the smoke of a burning morning. The records are silent on the later years of many others, but the reunions of the 1970s and 80s began to bring them out of their silence, men who had never told their wives what really happened in the water, finally able to speak because they were among the only people who could understand. The legacy of that day is not found in the text of a citation or the weight of a medal. It lives in the story itself, passed down from men who refused to let their shipmates be forgotten. When a new generation of sailors climbed aboard a guided missile frigate named the Samuel B. Roberts decades later in 1986, they saw a bronze plaque bolted to the bulkhead. It bore the names of the original crew, and on the night that frigate struck a mine in the Persian Gulf, the men reached for that plaque. They touched the metal as they passed. They drew strength from the same well of courage that had driven a tiny destroyer escort to charge a battleship. That is the story's true measure, a moment in October 1944 that keeps giving back, year after year, as long as there are sailors who remember what it means to stand and fight. If you have your own memories of that era, stories passed down from a father, an uncle, or a neighbor who served in the Pacific, we invite you to share them in the comments below because we read every one. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Your support helps us keep bringing these stories to light. Thank you for listening.